Past exam question on repricing gap, part 1, understanding the question. This is the question as it's given in the exam paper, and I have highlighted in red the most important bits, but in fact everything in this question is important. Now, the first thing you need to keep in mind always is that in this question and for all the calculations, 1 year has 360 days, not 365. Yeah. Then essentially you have to calculate 3 measures of repricing gap. One, the basic one. Second, 1 year maturity adjusted gap, 1 year standardized gap, and finally you have to compare the results. Okay. You are given 2 formulas in the question. The first formula that is given to you is to answer the first question, which is the basic gap. And it's given here, the change in the net interest income is equal to the gap times the change in interest rate. And the second one is a complicated formula that I'll explain later in these slides. And you have also the explanation of some symbols. So SA is the rate sensitive asset, SL rate sensitive liabilities, and P is days to maturities divided by 360. Now remember this very, very carefully because it's going to be important. Yeah, right. You can read something to help you understand the theory behind it. When I sent you an email with the link to 2 other videos, I also attached a electronic version of a book. This book, Financial Institution Management. It's the 6th edition. There's a 9th edition, but the 6th is fine. What you need to read is the pages 195 to 205 of chapter 8. Right, so let's look at the definition of repricing gap, and I've highlighted in red the most important bit. So essentially a repricing gap is the difference between the assets and the liabilities. Okay, well, it's not any asset or any liabilities, it's the assets whose interest rate will be changed over some period in the future, and liabilities whose interest rate will be changed as well. Now, some period in the future, here it's going to be 1 year, yeah, which is 360 days. Remember that. Okay, moving on. The first definition was actually not complete. Yeah. The interest rate, the asset whose interest rate will be changed over some future period are also called rate sensitive assets, and liabilities whose interest rates will be changed over some future period are called rate sensitive liabilities. Now we have seen these 2 expressions somewhere in the question. Here, yeah, rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liabilities. So at some point you will have to identify. Right, if you look at the table given in the exercise and you want to identify which assets and liabilities are rate sensitive, the first thing you can do is to look at the name. Yeah, floating rate securities means that the rate changes every day. Okay, it's rate sensitive, that's obvious. Floating rate bond, same thing. The interest rate paid on the bond changes every day, every week, but it changes, so it's rate sensitive. Now, if you only look at the name, you will conclude that you have only one asset and one liability that is rate sensitive. That would be a mistake, because the way to determine which one is rate sensitive or not is to look at the number of days left until you reprice it. So let's work at an example where it's not obvious. You have fixed rate installment loan. During 270 days, which is 9 months in this exercise, because 1 year has 360 days, then during 270 days, then you have a fixed rate. Well, what happened in the remaining 3 months? You don't know. After 270 days, the interest rate on this loan can go up, down, stays the same, but essentially you don't know, and because you don't know, you have to consider that it is a rate sensitive asset. By this measure, your floating rate security is also rate sensitive, because the rate that it applies now is valid for 90 days. In any case, after 90 days it is repriced, and the interest rate after 90 days can go up, down, or stay the same. For demand loans, well, 0 days to maturity means that it's going to be refinanced today. So when you look at the assets, you have the last one is a fixed rate mortgage. Is it rate sensitive? Well, if you look at the number of days to maturities, you see that it's going to be repriced in exactly 2 years, because there are 360 days in the year in this exercise. Your repricing horizon is 1 year. You are not interested in anything that happens after 1 year. So for the purpose of your repricing gap, this fixed rate mortgage is in fact not rate sensitive. Yeah, it's going to remain with the same interest rate for 2 years, and you're not interested in anything beyond 1 year. So this one, demand loans, is rate sensitive floating rate securities. Fixed rate installment, rate sensitive. Fixed rate mortgage is not. Now let's look at the liabilities. Again, you have to look at the days to maturity. 0 days to maturity means that basically now the rate can go up, down, or stay the same, but the rate can change, so it is rate sensitive. Fixed rate deposit, the name says that it should be rate insensitive, but the number of days to maturity repricing says differently. 180 days equals 6 months. What will happen after 6 months? Well, you don't know. The rate can go up, down, or stay the same, but in any case it is sensitive because it can change. The floating rate bond, we've seen that the name says it's changing. Here 360 is the limit of your repricing horizon, but because it is 360 and not 361, you have to take it into account. So in this exercise you have 3 rate sensitive liabilities and 3 rate sensitive assets. Okay, now difference between rate sensitive assets whose interest rate will be repriced over some future period. So this is the complete definition, if you want, because what we're interested in is to see what happens to your net interest income when you reprice your assets, in the sense that if the maturity of the asset arrives, then you can refinance it at a lower or a higher interest rate. This is what matters. It's the issue of repricing. Yeah. Okay, and that's what you see in the questions. You see, the first question is calculate the 1 year, that's your horizon, repricing gap. 1 year, your horizon maturity adjust gap, and the 1 year standardized gap. But after you've calculated the gap, you have to figure out what the effect it's going to be on the net interest income of the bank. Yeah, good. Now, what is a maturity adjust gap? You have a definition here. It's simply a difference between rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities that are weighted for the time period from the date of maturity of repricing to the end of the gaping period, and the weight is the time between the maturity date and 1 year. Okay. The standardized gap, which you need for the third question, is the maturity adjusted gap, which you have to weight by the sensitivity coefficients. Now, what on earth is that? Well, you have a definition here. Beta is the sensitivity of the interest rate of the assets relative to a market interest rate, and gamma is the same for the liabilities. So what is a market interest rate? Well, you have here LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, Euribor, which is a Euro Interbank Offered Rate. So this LIBOR interest rate is the market interest rate that banks charge each other globally, so on any asset in any currency, major currency. Euribor is more or less the same, but only for the euro. And every market in the world has a special rate that is an interbank rate. For example, in Mumbai you have the MIBOR. No, it does exist, MIBOR. It's the Mumbai inter market rate. Hong Kong has one and Shanghai has one. So why is it important? Because when you are refinancing your assets and your liabilities, if your asset is in euro, well, any change in the LIBOR will not be very important for you. It won't affect that much the net interest income you get from this particular asset. However, this particular asset will be more sensitive to the Euribor interest rate. So you need to adjust, if you want, your measure of repricing gap to the fact that you have different interest rates and your assets and liabilities can be dependent on different interest rates. Now, how do you get this data? Well, it's given to you in the table. So that's very easy. You just have to use it because it's there. It's the last column. Okay. Now let's move on to the formulas. The first one, to answer the first question, is simply that the change, so this triangle here means the change in the net interest income is equal to the gap times the change in the interest rate. Now, this is the wording of the question. G, so here, good. And the change in the interest rate is given to you in the question, and it's 0.05%. So all you have to do, in fact, is calculate G and plug in there, because the delta R is given to you. So that's very easy. And that's what is summarized here. All you need to do is calculate G and plug it in with delta R. 0.05%. No, I think it's wrong. It's 0.005. Okay, sorry about that. This there's a zero missing. 0.5% is 0.005. Moving on to the formula in question 2, and this is this thing. If you're not familiar with symbolic math, now is not the time to learn it, but I'm going to explain what it is. This symbol here means sum from j equals 1 to j equals n. You're summing what? Well, you're summing this multiplication here. So the sensitive asset j times 1 minus pj, days to maturity, for the asset j. Now the asset j is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up to n. Okay, here you're going to sum the sensitive liability k, which goes from 1 to m, times 1 minus the days to maturity of the liability k. So what is m and n? Well, we don't know, you see. That's why symbolic math is very generic. Here we have seen that m is 3, and here we have seen that n is 3. We've seen it from the table, right? Now, if you translate this in plain English, all this formula means the following. The maturity adjusted gap is equal to the sum of all the rate sensitive assets multiplied by 1 by the time between the maturity date and the end of the gaping period, minus the sum of all the rate sensitive liabilities multiplied by the time between maturity date and the end of gaping period. Now, where do you see the end of gaping period? Sorry. Well, I've highlighted in red the number 1, but because it means 1 year. So this means that this formula is in years, but every data in the table is in days. So you will have to make some adjustment to this formula before you use it. But we'll come to that later. Before we move on to solving the question, I'd like to give you an example of how you use this formula in full, I mean how you write it in full without the sum symbol. So let's assume you have 3 assets. This means that your n is going to be 3 and your m is going to be 2. So you have to sum for this multiplication for an asset going from 1 to 3. So sensitive asset 1 times 1 minus P1 plus sensitive asset 2 times 1 minus P2, sensitive asset 3 times 1 minus P3. Because you have only 2 liabilities, you take liability 1, you multiply by the weight, which is 1 minus P1, then you add liability 2 multiplied by its weight, which is 1 minus P2. You add them up. You see you have a bracket here, so you add the 2 of them and you subtract the sum from the sum of the liabilities. Moving on to the standardized 1-year gap, which is something you need for the third question, and it's the one when you have to adjust the maturity adjusted gap by the sensitivity of the interest rate to a market interest rate, so the beta and the gamma. Again, here we have n equals 3, m equals 2. So this part here is the same as we've seen in the previous slide. So basically it's the same as the maturity adjusted gap. All you have to do is multiply by the respective beta. So for the first asset you have beta 1, the second asset you have beta 2, the third asset you have beta 3. For the liabilities, this multiplication here comes from the maturity adjusted gap. All you have to do is multiply by the respective sensitivities to the interest rate, gamma 1 and gamma 2. This is the end of the first part explaining the question. In the second video, I'm going to show you how to solve the question.